we increasingly need people who have a sense of curating for longevity, because what we keep seeing, again, for, using like the TikTok example or the sort of the feed example, there's this sense of always viewing what's new. The most recent thing is the thing that's at the top of your feed or at the top of, whatever. It's like the first thing that you're seeing, right? So it's a sort of prioritization of the new and the shiny. But curators and sort of the taste makers, as it were, taste deliverers, it's their role to then sort of sift between all the new to find the meaningful.
Pumla, thank you for being on. And I know we met just before the new year and had a great conversation together. And thank you for coming on and agreeing to have a follow-up. There was a lot we got into, and I think a lot of unanswered questions because the time sort of ran out. So it was nice to be able to get you here. I know the time zones are pretty difficult, but thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Of course. One philosophy that kind of stuck with me when we were talking and when you shared your presentation with me was the fact that, in your opinion, every design practice performs a worldview. And I'd just love to dig into that a little bit more and understand what you mean by that sentence and what your philosophy is around that.
Yeah, so what I mean by that is that design is never neutral. It is a manifestation of either a philosophy or a definition or whatever the case is. It's always sort of built on top of something. And I think a little roundabout example comes from one of the objects that I've been making right now, which is a chair. And this has been through my practice called With Another, obviously with the sort of theoretical support of AOCD, which we're going to talk about. And in collaboration with Heath Nash, who's an amazing design practitioner here, very well known for his sense of sustainability and regeneration. And he currently serves as the head of sustainability for a company called Wonders. Long story short, I saw everything from a point of definition, and this project was no different. In doing this exploration, I uncovered that the word chair in its origins actually described a role that a person held. And the chair was made to serve as a reflection of that person. And now it has sort of devolved to being an object, which shows kind of how backwards we have it now. Now the chair dictates how we sit. And that's the worldview that we practice within. But when you sort of define it as a person or as a role, the outcome is different because it serves the person that it is made for. So I think it is a very sort of small example of the invisible scripts that we follow when we design at present. They define things like what we view as normal, as valuable. And in the end, it's a kind of mirror effect where our outputs mirror the sort of internal hierarchy of values. So if we view profit over people, then the design is extractive, right? But if it centers life, then it is regenerative. So I think that's sort of that in as succinct a way as I could put it.
And so in some of your presentations, you've said that design is truly governance through form. So for example, when you design a city, when you design interfaces or create brands or policies, we're deciding actually who gets to survive, who gets to breathe, and what gets erased within that same process. And so for anyone who still thinks that design is just making something look good or making something be aesthetically pleasing, can you walk us through how, in your view, design actually does function as governance versus aesthetics or decoration?
Part of what you're referring to is this idea of, I guess, design as governance, and sort of design as granting permissions. I guess I sort of have to bring it back to my upbringing in some ways. And so it is a kind of like a roundabout way of answering, but I think it's important to sort of give a sense of the foundation. I am from South Africa and I currently live in Johannesburg. That's where I am right now. And I was born in a post-apartheid South Africa, part of a generation called the Born Frees, which is a title that celebrated the fact that we were born into a kind of freedom, right? And it was years later in my graduate education, which was focusing on globalization and development, that I would sort of discover the thinking of a political economist, if I could say that, named Amartya Sen. And he spoke to there being five freedoms. And the political freedom, which we're celebrating as Born Frees, is just one of the five. The other freedoms include the freedom of economic facilities, which is accessing things like credit and trading, social opportunities being, education, healthcare, transparency guarantees, things like freedom from corruption and ability to sort of trust, the right to protective security, which is things like social security, unemployment benefits, etc. And so, yet what we were celebrating rather is just sort of 20% of the full freedoms, whereas the other 80% were designed to be insanely difficult to replace. These were, or rather actually there were design ministries in the apartheid government, and they had very specific mandates. I think the one which is the Department of Native Affairs actually, and within there they created the Land Act, which basically limited Black residents to accessing public spaces and public parks, because the ability to congregate would obviously mean resistance, or the ability to resist the government. So as a Black person, you'd have to walk 17 minutes to the nearest park, whereas a white person would only have to walk 7 minutes. Things like how the soil in townships, so Black people were migrated out of where they were into these sort of constructed urban areas called townships. And the soil quality there was often very shallow and nutrient poor, meaning that you couldn't grow your own food there. And some of them were set within areas of low rain forecast. There was also things like or policies like the 40-40-40 rule, where Black people's houses were meant to be 40 square meters, 40 kilometers away from any urban centers, such that you would spend 40% of your salary on transport alone, which really, really minimized obviously what else you could possibly do, right? And then there was also then the Know Your Place campaigns, which included materials that constantly reminded Black people what they sort of assigned roles were, and it took place in the form of propaganda movies, etc. And so it sort of comes back to the fact that we now sort of, as I said, celebrate the fact that we have this freedom. But for me, it speaks to the fact that there's this fallacy that design just has to do with beauty. And while beauty is a human right, one of our celebrated architects, rather, Samaya Valley, she talks about how beauty is just one of the many elements, even though it is a human right, but it's one of the many elements that sort of design creates. Design's function is much bigger than just that alone, even though that is a big deal. So sort of speaking to that, I think in terms of like who is being granted permissions and, what is being denied and by who and all of that, I think our role as designers is a lot bigger than we tend to think it is. And we're the people who create these permissions, and we're the people who can, in some ways, take them away. Really, we really influence, I think, a lot more than we believe.
Or that we're aware of, right? Because I think most of us, we're trained to create something that feels polished and a lot of our education, and then when we get into the world of work, it's all about aesthetic, something that's aesthetically pleasing. Obviously, there's briefs that we have to adhere to. But when the brief comes along your desk, it's like, you have to obviously know why you're doing something and have a great concept or philosophy around how you're going to execute the design problem. But we always place aesthetic beauty really high, because I think that's where people see value. It's almost like money well spent, right? So I'm giving you X amount of money to execute on this brief and this design problem I have. Like, I want it to look good and I want it to look beautiful. So for all of the designers listening, which I believe there's a lot of the creative industry, whether it's graphic design, motion design, whatever, to a designer who thinks like, I just make visuals, I just make beautiful images, or I just ship features, that work. What would you say to them about the kind of governance and power that they actually hold, that maybe they don't even realize, but they're exercising in their everyday decisions?
There is no just. I think we have to start there, because that sense of thinking really diminishes, I think, the power that we hold. When you're creating a feature, or you're creating really whatever it is again sort of giving life to a certain vision. And so I think when we sort of minimize that, then we are very much losing our sense of agency, I think, within that. It also kind of assumes that we're just creating from a sort of neutral standpoint, of which there is no neutrality within design and within anything that we do, right? So yeah, I think of it kind of that way, that there is a lot more embedded within every single. In fact, let me put it this way: a software is a sum of its parts, right? So each and every single one of those parts is imbued with a power that is only visible when it's within the whole, but it is still contributing to that whole. So there is very much significance within that, right? I also think that when we sort of think of ourselves as like just making visuals, we're kind of normalizing a reality, right? We're basically teaching people that success and beauty and happiness looks like what we have right now. And so I'm just adhering to that with the visuals that I'm just making. And so, again, you have to realize, I guess, that if you are in the business of visuals, you're the person who's cultivating desire. You're cultivating what people then look to. And that is cultural governance, right? I also think about how people who are making features, they're kind of gatekeepers of time in a way, because they sort of decide where an interaction is frictionless or where it's meaningful. And then there is also, as I said, I think, to sort of top it all off, the sense of complicity, if we just relinquish the fact that everything that we do is a kind of vote for the world that we're building.
I'm sure, maybe you've always thought like this, or maybe this view was formed like over time, like throughout your own practice. But when did it start to shift? And when it did, when did you realize that your design decisions were informing kind of like what happens tomorrow? I think a lot of us think very much in the present. We have to figure out a solution to a problem now. And I don't know if I've ever really, been in a situation where, especially in the beginning of my career, where I was like really thinking about like, tomorrow. Maybe I would be thinking about how is what I'm making going to be timeless in its existence, but not necessarily thinking about how until maybe my current position now, how what we put out actually affects tomorrow and the results of tomorrow.
I hate when people say I've always, because it's like, really, were you thinking that when you were 3 years old? But for as long as I guess I can sort of remember, I was very curious about why things are the way they are, and thinking about the fact that there has to be a reason that something exists the way it does. And I used to ask my mom that quite a bit, like, why are, the colors in this outfit this way? Or why? I was that annoying kid. And she's just like, no, some things just are. So I think there was a part of me that sort of had that awareness of there being just more. But I will say that something that sort of further solidified that thinking or that inquiry was growing up in a township myself, and yet going to school in a sort of like affluent area or in a town. And I sort of physically lived through that transition where, you could very visibly see that you were leaving the township and going towards the nicer part of town. And then you sort of come home and kind of do the reverse.
Can you explain what a township is, just for those who may not?
Yeah, so a township is kind of a set of settlements developed by the apartheid government. And these were places where, black people for the most part. I was going to say people of color, but really black people were designated to live. And they were built to be as oppressive as possible. Some townships, like the one I grew up in, the toilet was outside. There was no bathroom. And so, it's like, come rain or shine, you had to literally leave the house. There were 3 rooms, and that one was like sort of better off than some of the other townships where there were 2 rooms or some more 1 room. And basically it was just the kitchen, a living room, and a bedroom. And so in cases where, if you don't have, in cases where, you have like kids, etc., there's very little privacy, and very little comfort, right? So that's a township. And because, as I said, it was built to be as oppressive as possible from an urban planning standpoint, it was just dry and arid. They were just dusty. It was always dusty. You were forever cleaning the house, literally, because there was always dust. So you'd be cleaning twice, thrice a day. And so, like it was very physically visible when you were either entering or leaving the township. And there were points where, it might or might not sound believable, but I literally just did not want to go home. I dreaded going home. I wished I could be in a boarding school. And my school used to be a boarding school way back when. And, when I'd hear those stories about, well, it was a Catholic school, so the nuns used to live there and all of that, I was just kind of like, it would be nice to be living here, because I really just resent going home. And so I think it was truly that switch in context on a daily basis that really started making me think a little bit outside of sort of the now. It was just a really weird context switch that just made me think a little bit outside of my present. And it's not that I had answers or anything as yet, but I definitely had curiosities. One of them being how at school I was learning about, things like global warming and not burning fossil fuels. But then I'd have to go home to the reality that when there was no electricity, we have to burn coal in the coal stove in order to eat, so it just kind of forces you a little bit outside of some of the theoretical thinking to approach a present that is the way that it is, which is unfavorable. And so it may sound a little bit oxymoronic in that you would think that, I guess, it would force me to be more narrow or more today focused. But because I did also have the educational backing or, what have you, that sort of challenged my present every time, I think it did kind of widen my thinking and my perspective a little bit.
Mm. And I think it's such an interesting perspective that you had, because the way you describe it is you're switching every day, right? You're going to school, you're having an experience, you're coming back to where you live. And I think most of us maybe have a switch of experience when we go on holiday, right? We take a vacation or a trip somewhere to get out of the environment that we're in. But generally, like where you grow up and you go to school, maybe it's not that far away, or even if it is, it's still in relatively the same socio-economic environment, and you're with people of similar socio and economic statuses, right? So you're not really experiencing both ends of the spectrum so dramatically. So I always talk about like my traveling really influenced my worldview and added so much to how I saw outside of what was just present in front of me. But that was only maybe once a year, being able to leave the country. And, you know, my mom made sure that we traveled and we had family in America. So I just remember always looking at the sky, and the sky just seemed higher. And I don't know if that was a metaphor for like feeling somewhat like depressed or oppressed with the grey sky in London, right? And that just being a metaphor for like always feeling like there was something pushing me down. But yeah, it was nice to leave and nice to see the blue, higher sky. And I felt like, oh, in another country or in another space, maybe there's less of a limit to what I could do. And would you say that happened to you in your environment every day? Like you can kind of see maybe the future for yourself?
Yeah, you know what? That is actually very true. And I think that is sort of emphasized by that desire that I had to just like not go home sometimes, you know, where I was like, I wanted to stay where the environment was literally engineered to have a sense of possibility. Um, and And yeah, on top of that, I mean, I saw the very real differences between my thinking and my existence as opposed to, you know, some of my neighbors where teen pregnancy was very much a thing. Um, teen suicide was a thing. And I didn't think about it as often, or rather, sorry, I didn't think about it as being uncommon until I was writing a paper in graduate school. And the advisor I had then was like, you do realize that's not normal, right? To know that many people who have ended their lives. And it was because I lived near a train track, so I could hear every time somebody had ended their life. And so, yeah, so I think, you know, sort of living within that reality, but then also being able to sort of access hope and possibility, you know, every day definitely allowed me to sort of see a little bit outside my frame. And I think another thing that was very transformative that happened very early in life, when I was 15, I got the opportunity to go to boarding school in the Netherlands. And so this was just me going to the Netherlands, being with, in the boarding house at the time, there were 50 of us from 42 different countries. And that will definitely put everything, you know, on its head and sort of challenge your convention. So yeah, I would say that definitely that sort of daily experience. But then in addition to that, I think being able to leave home and literally live with people from everywhere, and then, you know, went to college in the States, and then it's kind of like the rest is history. But I think I've been blessed with the sense of like multiple contexts around me all the time.
Yeah. And you mentioned agency a little while ago. And I've been thinking a lot about agency specifically in the time that we're in. I think it's very important to kind of take control of your career, your path, your decision making. There's so much now that is fighting for our attention. And agency to me is something really present, or the choice to take agency over decisions. Like when you get up in the morning, there's so many distractions that can stop you for at least an hour before you even wake up to get on with what you're supposed to do. You could sit in bed, you could be scrolling, versus getting up, having your water, going to the gym for an hour. There's, countless things. When you get home, there's the TV. There's so many platforms and products fighting to get your attention now. And I love how you sort of kind of framing, or my interpretation of your framing is like how our choices shape our future, right? And I just wanted to like understand a little bit like how you see agency within your life. Like you definitely seem to have taken agency over a lot, and you have a quite a poignant view on things and how you create. But what does agency kind of mean to you now?
Agency means recognizing that there is no space for apathy. I'm not one of those people that thinks you can like mindset your way out of everything, right? Because they're obviously like very real things. But I think within the space that you and I operate in, and pretty much I can imagine like, I don't know, 99% of the listeners of this platform, we do have a lot more agency than we credit ourselves for having. So I think, also coming from a culture where I thought about this months ago around the time that we would meet, as I was preparing for a keynote address. And I started thinking about definitions, of things a lot. And I guess I was also doing this sort of big translation exercise. I was translating some of the, ALCD principles to different African Union languages. And one of the things that started sort of coming to my mind was, what's the word for plan in my language? Like making a plan, or an architectural plan, or, just forecasting, or, what have you. And I realized that that word does not necessarily exist. It's all just kind of to design, and again, I guess even within the English context, design, there is a sense where it could be you drafting something, it could be you making something, but there is kind of like a wide spectrum of what that word covers. Whereas if I try to think of an equivalent, it's really just to make or to do. There isn't this sense of like some abstract future, for which I can plan. It's like you just have to do what you have to do, and that's it. And so I've realized that, maybe even if I couldn't quite literally put it in words like that all the time, I think just coming from that cultural reference means that, it's like I realize that things are a lot more active than passive, and there really isn't that luxury to just not take ownership of what's within your realm to take ownership over. Right. So yeah, I think that's kind of how I see it.
Yeah, it's almost like our duty to be present and to take agency. And yeah, as I was saying, I think that's one battle that we all experience right now on quite high degrees, depending on how exposed we are to the distractions that I was mentioning. And speaking of, time and, making the most of our time, I remember when we met and I had to write it down. I know you brought up John Mbiti's description of time, right? And it's something that, we're not necessarily moving towards. It's something that's made of past, and time is made of past and present, right? Which I agree. I believe that time is kind of cyclical and it's not linear. But the future in this sense is moving back towards us to meet us versus us moving towards the future itself. And that was like, it just made me stop. And I remember I was like, oh, let me take a note of that. And, how has that sentiment sort of changed your perspective of life and how you move through life and create? We just touched on like agency and the fact that, we must, take control and just do things. And that's kind of like our duty. But now thinking that the future is moving back towards us, how has that changed your perspective?
I think the big thing is, and I hate to abuse the word apathy, right? But sometimes this distant future gives us this like false sense of security. And, just gives us this, it sort of gets us to abuse our hope, I think. Hope is only active when it is that you've done everything that you can, and you're sort of leaving that which you could do to the elements. And that's the hope. It's the part it's the fact that you've done what you could, right? But then when you have done nothing and you just kind of hope, I think, yeah, we're very much abusing it. So I think it's sort of changed my way of being through that perspective. But it's also just realizing that everything that we do, every single thing we embody is literally shaping reality. And I'm reminded, I guess it's sort of like the development part of my mind that sort of comes in, but elections. We have this idea of elections as being in like 4 or 5 years, right? Um, and there are sort of different, ways of voting. But when I think about the American approach, right, where you start with several candidates and then they all sort of like whittle down towards the very end. When it gets down to the wire, when we get to sort of the two people, you'll hear people say things like, "Oh no, there were only two candidates left and we didn't have much of a choice." It's like, well, you did. You exercised your freedom.
Yeah, you did in the beginning.
Exactly. You exercised your freedom in the form of refraining. And now time has sort of suddenly become imminent, and only now are you realizing that. And so I think that's the thing is like at least what it's meant for me or how it's changed my perspective is in realizing that every decision that we take every day is a vote for that future. And we owe it to ourselves to be as present as possible, because that distant future will one day be imminent, and we're going to be sort of caught or met rather with the decisions that we had made at some point long ago when we thought that this is really far away from us. I think a lot of the things that we're living through now, we at some point probably thought were like a lifetime away, and we're not realizing that they're not, you know? So I'd say that is probably the biggest transformation that has had for me.
Mm. And it's almost like, your sentiment, you're sort of saying like time evolves through us. It's not necessarily something that's just is always on the horizon. And because time kind of evolves through our actions, we have to be ever more present to, and I believe this, like the words we say, what we think. And this is just on like the personal level. And then on the collective level, I mean, it's a lot of that. It's quite difficult to control a collective, right? But certain governments seem to be pretty good at it. But I think on our personal level, we have to be able to really understand that every movement, every word we say, every interaction we have changes what's about to happen in our future in a way, right? And then that made me sort of think about the manifestation. And so if we have like, manifestation as a kind of theory and bring in the reality from the future into our present through our thoughts and our words, where do you draw that line between taking action and manifestation? Because I think there's two ends of that spectrum too. There's people that, I'm manifesting, I'm gonna, this is just gonna happen to me. If I spend enough time thinking about it and put up a vision board, I can bring this future into my existence. And then there's people that just do and try to make that happen. Like, what's your opinion on manifestation versus like doing?
I mean, I think of like, manifestation, or I guess in my sense, I think of like prayer, um, as something that's supposed to embolden you and give you a sense of what you can do. Um, it just doesn't make sense to me to just sort of sit and pray if there is something that I can do. And I just sort of hope that prayer sort of unveils the wisdom to me around what can be done, and then position me closer to that desired outcome, or closer to the miracle, I guess, that will sort of unfold. I think it's that thing where they say, um, I forget exactly how it's stated by those who are specialists in English, but it's something along the lines of, um, I'm not lucky, I'm prepared, you know? So I think it's that thing that there are actions we need to take so that when things are in alignment, or however way you want to think about it, we're ready to receive said miracle, and you're ready to execute. Exactly. So yeah, so that's honestly how I think about it. I recognize that you can't always action everything. Like, we don't always have the means or the whatever, but um I think the key is in putting ourselves in a space where, should said thing drop on your lap now, will you be prepared to move ahead and actually realize your dream?
Yeah. To receive it, to have the tools, and then to make it happen. Right. And I love that you've said this before. Like, we shouldn't be in a place of designing for the future, but we should be designing from the future. And that's like a pretty interesting reframing. How do you do that in practice?
I'd say in practice, it is, or I guess, like, even within like project management, maybe sort of moving away from deadlines for deadline's sakes, towards this idea of readiness. Um, I think that when we're chasing time, and having this very sort of scarce mindset, we leave plenty of room for loopholes, and for gaps to exist with really important things. So I think about how, yeah, when we're sort of racing against the clock, right, and we're thinking about like efficiency, I mean, within, say, people who are designing within the cybersecurity realm, I mean, you don't want to design so fast that you sort of leave room for, I don't know, for, yeah, whatever security threat to thrive.
The exploits.
Exactly. Whereas when you're sort of designing from the desired outcome that you have, I think you sort of give yourself the grace to properly, trial and error, or properly test things until they're ready. So it doesn't mean, we just sort of sit back now and we kick our feet up and, just chill because of, where we feel the vibes are leading us. Not necessarily. We're just being very realistic about, um, where friction needs to exist, rather than chasing frictionlessness. I mean, surely, I don't know how safe you would feel if it was that when you open your banking app, all you need to do to log in is just put your first name and last name. Like, that's not very secure. It's fast. It's frictionless, I guess, but that's not very secure, right? Like, you want friction in that specific part so that the rest of the experience can be frictionless. So if we just chase time, or we just sort of chase this like false idea of like, we're running out of time, whatever, um, that's when we leave lots of room for the undesirable outcomes. And then we're forever putting out fires, right? As opposed to, again, sort of recognizing that we can build backwards from an outcome. And then hopefully, of course, things will happen. This is not sort of, I don't live in like an airy fairy space where everything works perfectly when you sort of build that way, but at least you actually make room for learnings. So yeah, I kind of think of it that way.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, like the kind of evolution of my design experiences or my design career. I don't think I've ever had to really think as far ahead as I have now, and thinking about implications of what you're designing and how that affects the customer, right? Affects the audience, affects the experience of something over time. But there's also been a stage in my career where sometimes you can't even see ahead. Like you're trying to, it's like you're in survival mode. You're trying to design to a brief. You're trying to execute on a brief. You have a week to, come up with some kind of solution that's viable. And as we were saying before, looks great, right? So, for anyone who's sort of in that kind of position where it's like, I can't even see ahead next week or tomorrow, like how can I even be designing from like from the future if I'm stuck in my present right now? Like where does someone start in that scenario?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where you sort of go back to your values as a creator, and realizing, as I said, that everything that we do is informed by something. So even within a time crunch, you can still be intentional. And I think that's the key. The tastes that inform whatever it is that you're making, those are political. And so that is still like a kind of like a very small lever that you can pull on to create something that, yes, yes, you need to deliver it like immediately, but it can still be imbued with the intention. So yeah, I think this is where, yeah, our sort of theoretical foundations, our processes, those sort of things can honor that thinking in small ways. It doesn't have to always be a massive exercise, a massive endeavor. It is also just realizing that the biggest power is in those like micro decisions.
Yeah, and you mentioned taste, and I've been, thinking about now because we're going through a kind of transformation in at least the design industry. I think like with most industries, right, with advancements in technology, AI, etc., and thinking about how this new technology can fit into your design process. And admittedly, there are parts of the design process that are becoming more efficient. More efficient equals cheaper, right? And so thinking about the value that maybe once was in the time that something took equals costing more. Now thinking about where is that value now shifting for some of these parts of the design process as a whole. So one of those was taste, and been thinking a lot about taste and what is that. And that's like, it's the sum of your experiences. It's what your frames of reference are. What do you look at on a daily basis? What do you like? What do you keep? What do you throw away? And so all of this comes into like the design process. Like technology can provide an abundance of images, videos, ideas, but I still think there's power on the human level with that decision making and being able to direct something, a design, whatever it might be, or be the funnel, I should say, and direct where it should go, even though you can be presented with a lot more options now and things have become more efficient. And so, I've been thinking about like, how does the power of our own taste now play a part in really shaping the future? Because slight interruption there, but all good. Internet connections, happens to us all the time. So yeah, I was talking about taste and the fact that now I'm thinking that taste could potentially have more value, right? In the world of more abundance, where does it shift? Thinking like taste may now be something that might even have more value than what we considered it to be before, especially for us as humans, right? And so then it made me start to think about, well, if we're going to place or potentially place a lot more value on taste and human taste and judgment, how does that then play a role in shaping the future? Like, could it even be more advantageous on a human level to be taste makers in a way, right? And to be able to curate and have the ability to curate and have a point of view, and then have, people rally around said point of view. and be able to, be maybe more on an individual level, have more of a say in what gets created and what doesn't.
I think taste only becomes more valuable. And that's why, to your point around the proliferation of information and access to basically infinite resources, curation has come up as a role that is now needed more than ever. I mean, I remember, I think maybe it would have been the middle or towards the end of, no, certainly around the middle of last year, that I was just seeing sort of an infinite number of TikToks, which were talking about how curation really is the need, the big need within the creative spheres. We need people who have the sense of taste, I guess, or who we can trust to be the people that sort of weed out quality from not quality and all of that. And so, yes, taste is only increasingly becoming more important. I also think about how its importance lies in the fact that it's not fact. The fact that it is contextual. It is built, it is accumulated, right? And in fact, this sort of sense of it not being fact, comes from my art education. I think it would have been in high school art class where we learned about the difference between style and taste, and how something may not be according to your taste, but it doesn't mean that it's stylistically inappropriate. So meaning that style is kind of, again, in this particular definition, the thing that is concrete, and taste is sort of built, as I said, by context, and it kind of rides on top of that. And so, yeah, it's like we need the people that are, gatekeepers is certainly not the right word, right? But we need the people that are sort of, the people who are sort of surveyors and able to sort of, to make the best decision out of understanding the contexts that we find ourselves in, which are always changing, in today's world. And I also think about how we increasingly need people who have a sense of curating for longevity, because what we keep seeing, again, for, using like the TikTok example or the sort of the feed example, there's this sense of always viewing what's new. The most recent thing is the thing that's at the top of your feed or at the top of, whatever. It's like the first thing that you're seeing, right? So it's a sort of prioritization of the new and the shiny. But curators and sort of the taste makers, as it were, taste deliverers, it's their role to then sort of sift between all the new to find the meaningful. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not to say that if something's new, it's not meaningful. Like you said, there's just a lot of it, and finding what is important and what's meaningful and what can have an impact. And I think in design, I've always looked back into the past, because I think back in the past, there wasn't so much to comb through as there is now. And I like to try to not design or reference something that maybe was done yesterday or last week, and look back a little bit further when maybe, I don't know, there could have been like a lot more thinking involved in creating something, or maybe a lot more craft, like handmade craft.
I mean, there needed to be intentionality at a certain point, right? And sorry to sort of jump in, but when we had more of a resource scarcity, you had to be mindful about what you're doing with said resources. And so when you're able to just sort of publish anything nowadays, or when you're able to just, sort of throw anything out there and have some kind of fidelity version of it, that we can lose intentionality. Doesn't mean we always do. But I agree with what you're saying. I think there used to be a point, especially around when I was in high school, where, when you do your research, you'd want to see what the latest paper or the latest reflection was. But now increasingly, I actually kind of, even from a theoretical background or from a theoretical perspective, find myself sort of trying to dig up those archival thoughts about certain things, going back to the kind of the principles or, whatever it is I can find, because the research was just done with so much more intentionality. It had to be. When you were flying into somewhere, on a plane of which there's only sort of once a week of, you had to really sort of go there ready with what you were looking for and being very specific about how you're using your time, as opposed to, as I said, we can sort of like shoot in and out, even just virtually now. Sorry to interrupt your thought, but that just sort of came up.
Yeah, no, I love it. I mean, it's like what you're almost bringing up also is like the fact that now to create, and we were talking about this earlier on in the conversation, like about things that look good or look beautiful. It's getting increasingly easier to make something that looks beautiful fast, or create a piece of writing that sounds really well done fast. Although, you can kind of tell still if something is generated or not. It's like that beauty and efficiency level of getting to the result quicker, versus before we had these tools, there was a lot more research, a lot more development that had to go into some of this writing or some of this research, or to produce a final product. It just took a lot more human time, I think. So it's nice to dig back and understand, because like you said, that the level of effort and fidelity of what was created then, it did take a lot more time to be able to produce something like that. And yes, I'm interested to see where it all goes, honestly. With efficiency becomes an abundance at all levels. I think you get a lot of mediocre stuff, and we're going to get a lot of probably really beautiful, well done, crafted work also. So I think, like you just said, it's combing through things that are actually produced now, not discarding everything, of course, because there are going to be some gems in there too.
There's some gems there. Yeah, when we have democratized access, or sort of as democratized as it's ever been, right? Then the people who have often existed on the periphery, they sort of come a little bit to the center. And so at least now we're able to see those glimpses of brilliance that we maybe mightn't have accessed before because of how resource intensive it might have been for them to sort of share their voice.
And ideas, yeah, and voice and ideas being shared at a global scale, and not needing potentially some tools or methodologies that there was no access to in certain places and environments. So switching a little bit to African Life-Centric Design. Please explain what is ALCD?
ALCD is a set of principles, frameworks that come from the continent, but not only for the continent. It is an articulation of the multiple ways of seeing the act of making from the continent. It is, I think it sort of came from a lot of what we've discussed, which is the sort of narrow definitions that we've been working with for the longest time, and thinking about how illogical it is to envision the future without consulting some of the systems and the people that have survived the longest. There's clearly a lot to be learned, I think, from the continent that we're only beginning to understand. So LCD is that attempt, I'd say, to center some of those ideas, some of those ways of seeing, and imbuing them in our ways of making.
And so why is it important?
So I'd say LCD is important because, as I mentioned, this is a continent that's home to literally the oldest First Nations communities, right? So these are people who have survived the longest, and there's clearly a kind of wisdom that exists here that is to be learned from at a wider scale. And secondarily, we have often thought of this sort of false dichotomy of there being a global north versus a global south. But in fact, when we actually look at things from a from a statistical reality standpoint, there is only the global minority and the global majority, the minority being the global north and the majority being the global south. And when you sort of frame it that way, then you realize that we've actually been using the frameworks, the very limited frameworks of the global minority to build for the global majority, which really just does not make sense, regardless of which sort of frame of reference you use. And, once again, it is very clear that the individualistic, extractivist ways of seeing that we've used have gotten us to a point where the outcome is clearly undesirable for us all. It is very clear that we're falling behind in terms of sustainability. We are at a point where resource extraction is happening at a much faster rate than replenishing. And we have all the scientific warnings from the climate standpoint, from several standpoints, public health, etc. So it is clear that the frame of reference we've had before has led to an undesirable outcome today and certainly an undesirable future. So it is important to look outside of that singular frame and start looking to the global majority to get a sense of what wisdom and what ways of seeing we have not yet sort of included. So it's less to say that we should not be doing this, but to say, let's widen our perspective. Let's pluralize the ways of seeing. Let's consider other perspectives and see how that informs better processes for a better humanity and for better life overall.
And in your practice and in your presentations, how do you incorporate this more pluralized perspective on the world?
I think it takes the shape of always making sure that I've got as many of the stakeholders that I'm building for as possible, whether they are humans or non-human living forms. So one of the ways is, if I'm looking at, say, product design, thinking about as many sort of need spaces as exist. So, think about, say, abilities or disabilities. Are there certain things that I can learn from neurodivergence, from, say, physical disabilities that maybe I wouldn't think about from my perspective? Cultural frameworks, again, sort of depending on what it is that I'm working on, whether it's like a branding thing or if it's like an actual product as per the chair that we're just talking about. So it is sort of thinking about the peripheries that tend to be missing when we're creating said proposition. And one of those peripheries is also like the land, and, I tend to say land or living world, as opposed to nature, because we're also part of nature. There is no actual separation between us and nature. But, there's also what's sort of called, I guess, the empty chair technique, which is when having meetings, if it's a literal meeting, having an actual empty chair that represents the land, that we're building with, or, the future generations, or whatever sort of invisible stakeholder that is really important to think about. And literally looking at that empty chair does sort of shift things a little bit. It's not a sort of like, as airy-fairy as it may seem, as much as it is that it does kind of, adjust your positioning a little bit and remind you that there is another stakeholder at the table who we consistently need to sort of keep at least sort of mentally referencing. And it is a very practical tool, whether in person or even online. You can sort of, even like maybe put a sticky note of your actor on your screen, just to sort of keep reminding yourself of who else we need to think about in this conversation. So yeah, I think of it sort of practically in that way.
Yeah. I love that reminder because it's so easy to not include the outside in our thoughts and in our discussions and the natural sort of living world. I never thought about that at all. So yeah, thanks for sharing that. It's something to really consider, and these practical tools. I love just learning how people sort of incorporate things into their design process in a different way from how I do on the day-to-day. So yeah, thanks for sharing that. And on the subject of the living world, I did take a statement from one of your presentations. I had to include it here for this discussion. It's a little bit long, so I'm going to read it and have a question about it. So, it's the honor the living world and anchor all design within it, not merely on top of it, and embrace the symbiotic relationship with the ecosystem, considering it an active participant in the design process. So our task is to heed that voice as we would another human around a brainstorming table, which is what you were just saying, right? I think with the chair, and honoring that voice in its kind of maybe absence in the room, but should still be around the table. And so you've elaborated on like how you do this and how you think about this in your day to day. But could you elaborate and share an example where you've personally treated the living world as this kind of co-designer, as this empty chair in the room, and how others could maybe incorporate this into their own design thinking?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think within my like furniture design example, we were thinking about just materially, how do we make the most out of the least resources possible. And that constriction, or that constraint rather, brought about a very interesting design. I'll share the link and stuff, and people can sort of take more of a look at that. But what it has led to is using one long, sort of thin piece of wood, and then cutting the four components of the chair out of it. We did not it's not sort of joined by glue or anything. It's just these four components that you can construct and deconstruct as you will. And it's used making just the wood and nothing else. And, of course, once it's reached sort of peak utility, however way that's defined, and hopefully several years down the line, it's easily like recyclable, or you can do whatever else you want to do with those wooden parts. So that has been an example of us sort of thinking that if we really want to bring this object, if we want to bring it to reality, how can we do that in a way that really honors the materials that we're using? How can we do that in a way that is both sort of taking and giving at the same time, sort of that sense of reciprocity, right? How do we make sure that at the end of this thing's cycle, it can fit very well back into the place where it came from, in its original, sort of within its form still. So, if we had other adjoinments or anything, then we'd kind of have a bit of a problem with that. But with it just being wood, it could actually just very well just go back to the earth, as it is, so.
Yeah, because it's like more in its natural state.
Exactly. So that is a very practical example of how we kind of did that audit, and we actually really sat with all the principals and thought through. We're like, this object is not ready if it actually does not align to all of these things. And again, it isn't treating it as a checklist, right? But it is just, again, sort of keeping that intention alive. And of course, within this sense, we had the luxury, because it's our own internal project, to really actually make sure that it meets the mark in every single way. Yet, I think even within a constrained environment, as we were saying, I think there are still ways that you can just keep that intentionality top of mind and see what small ways you can infuse that more empowered mindset in what you're creating.
And you mentioned that you had the luxury. Was it just more about the luxury of time? Like, would you say it kind of slows down your process? Of course, there's probably quicker ways to do something like this.
Yeah, the luxury wasn't so much of time. It was actually just creative freedom. So theoretically, we could take it in any direction, but we were very much constrained by the commercial viability, by time, because he's the national designer that we were working with. He had also been sort of selected to be a part of a cohort of 9 designers who would be given or sort of gifted this thread to use in whatever design they would make. And it had to be done by September, by like 2nd of September. And I think we started this process properly in May. So we had that time constraint. We had, I think, a lot of the typical constraints. I mean, also like the financial constraint, right? That we cannot just like shoot for the moon with the budget. We're working with like very real materials here, and we have to keep it as local and as affordable and as everything as possible. But yeah, I would say the freedom was just in the creative. And I think that then does sort of inform the way you use your resources a lot easier, rather than, if you're sort of working with the idea of a very specific output that looks a specific way, then everything else that is constrained is probably further constrained by that.
And we're all used to having stakeholders, I think, some more than others. When you're in a large company, there's, generally a lot of people that have to have a say on something. There's kind of a safety mechanism in place to make sure that something is as successful as possible. And the more people that sometimes can provide an opinion, someone else's opinion or idea can just add to something that you have and, create something that's even more incredible than what you thought it could ever be, right? And it seems, would you say that your largest stakeholder is the living world?
Yeah, I think so. Honestly, I wouldn't have put it in those exact words. So thank you for saying it like that. But yes, I think so. And I think it's both the living world and, the world that is yet to be realized, right? So maybe it is an element of like future generations, or however way we want to put it. I think those are my biggest stakeholders, and it's also largely because I am already, just from a faith perspective, what we're talking about with prayer and like manifestation, etc. I come from a frame or a perspective that really believes in the things that we don't see and the power that exists within the invisible. So already for me, the sort of invisible is very tangible. And so, yeah, like for me, the biggest stakeholders are the ones that we don't see right now, or the ones that are not always very visibly in the room. So yeah, I think that's very beautiful framing. So thank you.
Yeah, I was just thinking about, just stakeholders and what you really have to pay attention to. And it just seems like your whole sort of philosophy is crafted around that. So I think it's a really beautiful thing. Again, I love the metaphor of the empty chair. I might have to start using something like that, in the room too.
Please do.
You've said that, you were talking about borders and the north part of the world and the southern part of the world, and looking into and understanding ideas from the south, not ignoring what we see and what we're living in now, but also opening up our mindset, right? And, you know, you've mentioned that the next era of design, celebrated design innovation, will be led by those who listen beyond the borders that they are currently in. And how do you then sort of like draw the line, or sort of, I don't know, just balance this kind of theme of cultural appropriation as well, right? Because we've all seen that, like you're sort of borrowing across borders and profiting from what you've borrowed, and ideas and materials and aesthetics, etc. So where do you sort of draw that line? Yes, we should be looking more plural and being able to, you know, take reference and understand thinking from other parts of the world, but then also being careful that we're not exploiting again.
Mm-hmm. I think this is where we place ontology over aesthetic. So where we have to look across borders to understand ways of thinking and like structures of governance and processes and approaches, more than just taking what we see, because that is kind of the aesthetic realm is the visual world, is the visual realm, right? It is the which is like the outcome of the things underneath. So yes, I think for me it's about seeking to understand those deeper layers, and the only ways you can do that is by incorporating the custodians of that wisdom of wherever you are looking to, in the same way as for, you know, a product, or when you're doing design research, you would go to the context that you're researching, or you're going to your potential, you know, consumer, you know, customer, whatever it is, because you recognize that there is something, that there's a wisdom that they bring from being embedded in that place that they're within. And we need that in order to create something successful, like truly successful and truly meaningful. And so it's the same thing, where we just need to be prepared to truly incorporate and do the uncomfortable exercise of incorporating those viewpoints a lot in a lot more of an intentional, focused way than just sort of looking at the visuals and be like, oh, I like this part of it, and kind of grabbing that, because that's when you hit appropriation, right? It's because you're just taking something out of its context. But it's very hard to do that when you are ensuring that the custodians of that context are a part of the process. And also listening, just it really requires reciprocity, right? So you don't get to just take a story without giving a resource back, I think. So yeah, there's that element of it for me as well, that, you know, once you incorporate the custodians, you have no choice but to make sure that the proposition you give back to them actually makes sense to them. And I think that's also why it's easy to just appropriate, because you don't have to hold that responsibility that comes with actually bringing people to the table, as it were. So yeah, I think it's about centering ontology rather than centering aesthetic.
Yeah. There's a lot of mindfulness that has to come into the equation. And again, it's almost like slowing down time, because it is easier just to see something and copy or borrow or take, right? And it takes a lot more investment to actually bring people along the way, which is the right way to do it. Because then I just feel like it's more successful, because your design or whatever you might be creating is more informed at every stage of the process, right? Instead of taking something and then not really knowing what to do with it. And then it just ends up as some, you know, artifact that has value, but not in the correct sense, right? So I think there's a lot to be said about that. I wanted to see where your mind was at, because I think that it could be very easy for things to, once you start to open up that knowledge, to take and appropriate, right?
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely.
I love that. I think when we met, you said this, and you said like at the heart of your work, there's this big question about our ancestors, right? And thinking about what kind of ancestors do we want to be? We're always thinking in like, in the past, and, who our ancestors were, and, what have we kind of taken from that legacy, what's ingrained in us from our ancestors, our intelligence, our DNA, how we react, etc. But yeah, now thinking about what kind of ancestors do we want to be? And so in this chapter of your life that you're in now, and I'm sure you thought about this, what kind of ancestor do you want to be?
I'm from and currently I'm in a country that is only 30 years old, or 31, 32 now as a democracy. And so we're constantly reminded of the aspirations of those who created the freedoms that we can now enjoy. I think it's a big thing that maybe we as young people experience, maybe more than young people in different frameworks, where the countries have existed for eons. And so for me, especially in this season, as somebody who happens to be around the same age as my country, I want to be the kind of ancestor who took the trauma and the anguish of the past and present and used it to inform decisions so that it was never wasted. And within that, I also want to make sure that the hopes and the aspirations of those who came before me also inform the beautiful things that we make. And it can be realized because they believed in laying their lives for something more beautiful to be experienced by those who they'll never meet. And so there's that sense for me, of, wanting to carry their hope forward and also do it in a way that, I have a niece and nephew, making sure that my niece and nephew gets just experience that freedom and don't have to think about it, because we kind of now have to do this thing where it's like it doesn't mean that they should lose intentionality, but as in that they can just experience without having to carry the baggage of what it took to get here, and sort of constantly be sort of teetering between like the past and the pain of it all, and the presence of the now. We want them to really just sort of exercise thriving rather than just sort of surviving. And I think that's the kind of ancestor that I hope to be in this current season of my life.
Yeah, like know the history, because that's really important, but not be caught in that tension. It's kind of like in the transition because it's not too long ago, right?
Exactly.
And so bringing forth, I think you framed it really nicely about being able to feel that freedom and not have to think about it, but just know what it was like before, I think. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, exactly. But right back at you in this chapter of your life, what kind of ancestor are you trying to become?
Yeah, I think I've been thinking a lot about this stage of my life that I'm in. I grew up with a single parent mother, and there was a lot of sacrifices that had to be made during my upbringing and things that she experienced. And then if you go back and then understand things that like my grandparents experienced and blah blah blah, and it goes down the line. And of course it's all perspective, because challenges that you may have or your family have, although they feel like challenges, are maybe nothing compared to other challenges that people may have in other parts of the world, and I'm fully aware of that. but this is, what your experience is. And I know that there was a lot of struggle, and it meant a lot to be able to come out here and like make some kind of career. And I'm at this stage now where I'm, sort of like in that give back stage of my life, and being able to think about those who are now coming, after me. That could be future children, that could be, people entering the design sort of career chapter of their life, and being able to offer guidance and not taken for granted where I've been able to fortunately be. And even if that's like one level up from where like my, say, parents' generation are, and being able to leverage the sacrifice that was made there and then improve, my situation here, and then be able to then set up a scenario where it can then improve the generations to come behind and keep on progressing in that sense. I think that's where I want to be able to just sort of impart the knowledge and life skills that I've acquired, good or good or bad. We've all experienced like different ends of the spectrum, but I think like experience is experience, and being able to, give that back. And I think it's very easy to be kind of selfish, especially when you're in a creative space, because I think creativity you become what you almost like become what you're creating. It's very involved, and I think it's very spiritual. And I've spoken about this before, where we have that ability to turn the invisible into physical things, and you can be very much wrapped up in that because it becomes very personal. And I think it's really important to be able to kind of come out of that frame of mind and understand that it's not just about you, and to be able to share experience and build some kind of platform where you can teach what you've learned, and you can think about others and how you can positively impact their life. So I think as an ancestor, I'd want to be remembered as somebody that like really cared about other people, and was able to create something and leave some kind of legacy or information, whatever artifact that may take, that people could learn from and understand that no matter what status or socioeconomic status you may have, if you do believe that you can do something, you can, and not be kind of swayed by others' opinions who might be projecting their insecurities onto you, and kind of beat the path down a little bit for others in that way, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. That's a very beautiful reflection. And I love how you talked about us as, as designers, as makers, as creators, as people who make manifest that which doesn't exist. It reminds me of, Kevin Bethune, who is a friend and designer, the author of the book Nonlinear. And he used to be a designer at Nike. I think he worked at the Jordans team. This is not a paid bit by him, just by the way. But he, in the beginning of his book, Nonlinear, he has put this Bible verse which is actually like one of my favorite as well. And it just says, "Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen." And it is by faith that we bring about the things that sort of exist in our mind's eye into sort of this world. We're kind of at that transition point of turning the things which aren't into the things which are, and really shape how people live their lives. So yeah, I love that little nod to that purpose that we serve.
Yeah. And I think it's hard, as you're going through life to like really say, this is who I want to be and this is what I want to be remembered by. But I think as you go through life, it starts to become a little clearer, and I think you just have to consciously it's nice to be consciously thinking about that. Like, how do I want to be remembered, or what kind of impact when I'm gone will people remember or benefit from, right? And on that note, like a last question for you is, if there was one message or one note that you could leave in somebody else's notebook after this episode, like what would that be?
I might be cheeky and sort of cut my sticky note in half, and so I could like put two. One would be in my language, which is "Renteo rema reno se hobe," and it means one. Actually, even the direct translation is very interesting. It means something along the lines of one finger cannot pick up grain. Meaning that in order to do something meaningful, you require a community. So I would say that. And then for my note in English, in my second half of the sticky note, would be, the future is already holding us all accountable. So do we like what it has to say?
It really is. Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you. I will make a note of that. And also, where can people find you? What's the best place for people to learn more about you, learn more about African Life-Centric Design? I know we touched on it. We went into some details, but I think, to really dive into and understand what your philosophies are, I think we've learned a lot today. But, if anyone wants to contact you or go deeper, I know you've been doing a lot of talks around as well. What's the best place?
Yeah, sure. African Life-Centric Design is a good place to start. We also do have an Instagram page that this is challenging me to make sure I keep up. And I also have, my LinkedIn, my Instagram. Just beep me, I will respond always. Just type my name and you'll basically find me everywhere. And for Instagram, swangs_express. But again, just literally type my name, I'll be there.
Right. And I will put all of this information in the episode details in the description as well. So thank you, Pumla. Thank you so much for sharing all of your inspiring words. And, it's one thing to experience your knowledge at the lunch table and, get into some real good conversation, but to go a little bit deeper and, explain some of these philosophies a little bit more, so that I always try to break them down in the simplest way possible. And you've been able to do that really well. And, a visual person, I've been able to really see some of these visual metaphors that you carry out throughout your design process as well. So might be, just borrowing a couple of those little tips and techniques. Yeah.
Please do.
It's really, really, really insightful. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone who's listening.